what you're telling me is that while we can think of S3 in similar terms to a traditional file structure, because it is flat, there is not that logical hierarchy. However, while we have to manage and maintain the data within it and keep track of the types and the sensitivity, the nice thing is oftentimes we don't have to necessarily worry about the logical structure because oftentimes there's an app sitting between the end user and the data itself that will interpret the data and put it into a structure or hierarchy. Hey, Ryan. I know we've been talking a lot about cloud services and cloud architecture, SaaS apps, things like that lately. And one of the biggest ones that I think comes up a lot in people's minds is S3. Can you walk us through a little bit about how S3 and the buckets are set up and how the data objects inside of those are stored and managed?
Yeah, sure thing, Killian. We hear about S3 a lot, and we're having a lot of conversations around storing data in S3. And, at its core, I kind of like to equate it a little bit like a file server, some of our classic storage arrays that we might see, either hosted on-prem or in the cloud. You have buckets, which are kind of like shares. It's a grouping of, data objects or files within. And then, of course, you have the data objects within a bucket, which are pretty similar to files that we're used to seeing. Although there are some key differences, while we do have the buckets and the data objects, there isn't necessarily, a logical hierarchy or an inheritance like we tend to see on something like a, Windows file system, for example, or a Windows file share. A lot of this tends to be done through tagging. So each data object can have up to 10 tags that are applied to that object that are unique. And then these are used to create a little bit more of a logical hierarchy, although it's still stored in a flat space per se.
So, given the fact that the data structure is really flat and it relies on tags, what challenges would users face interacting with the data stored in S3?
You think there'd be a lot of challenges because a lot of us are, used to seeing a logical hierarchy or some sort of, inheritance or directory tree. But what we tend to find is a lot of instances, there's an application that's interfacing directly with S3. So it's oftentimes not really the user interacting with the bucket directly. They're interacting through some sort of application. And oftentimes those applications are taking the tags and applying some sort of logic to it through the interface. So it's less of a direct access by the end user, more so them assuming a role or an application assuming access to that data.
That makes a lot of sense. So, what you're telling me is that while we can think of S3 in similar terms to a traditional file structure, because it is flat, there is not that logical hierarchy. However, while we have to manage and maintain the data within it and keep track of the types and the sensitivity, the nice thing is oftentimes we don't have to necessarily worry about the logical structure because oftentimes there's an app sitting between the end user and the data itself that will interpret the data and put it into a structure or hierarchy.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we see S3 being the back end of such a large percentage of applications on the cloud.
Awesome.